Millionaire followed his maid after work. What he discovered changed his life. Richard Anderson noticed that food was regularly disappearing from his kitchen. Small amounts, but enough to arouse his suspicion. As a man who built his empire, by distrusting everything and everyone, he decided to investigate the matter personally before confronting any staff. That's how, on a Wednesday evening, he parked his imported car a discreet distance from the gates of his Beverly Hills mansion in Los Angeles. He waited patiently until he saw Sarah, his maid of 5 years, leaving with 2 bags that looked heavy. Something twisted inside him as his suspicions were confirmed. She was taking things from his home. Dressed in a dark suit that wouldn't draw attention, he followed her onto public transportation, an almost alien experience for someone who hadn't set foot on a bus in over 2 decades. With each stop, the gap between his world and hers grew wider. When Sarah finally got off, in a neighborhood in South Central, Richard hesitated briefly before following her. The narrow, poorly lit streets bore no resemblance to the upscale areas he frequented. Keeping a safe distance, he watched as she turned into an alley and stopped in front of a small 2-story house. It wasn't her home. He knew that, as he had her address on file. To his surprise, he saw Sarah hand one of the bags to an elderly woman who greeted her with a warm hug. The scene repeated at 2 more houses. At one of them, Richard got close enough to overhear part of the conversation. "I brought a little extra today, Mrs. Jenkins. There were plenty of leftovers from dinner at the house. It was all going to waste anyway," Sarah said, handing over the bag. "God bless you, dear. Since my pension was delayed, I don't know what we'd do without your help." Richard stood motionless under the dim glow of a streetlight, processing what he'd just discovered. These weren't thefts in the usual sense. Sarah was distributing leftovers, food that would have been thrown away, to people in need. When she finally reached her own home, a small apartment in a modest housing complex, Richard watched from a distance as Sarah was greeted by a boy who looked about 10 years old. Even from afar, he noticed something different in the way the boy moved. The next morning at breakfast, Richard observed Sarah with new eyes as she served coffee. Her hands, rough from constant work, moved efficiently across the impeccably set table. He decided he needed to know more before drawing conclusions. For 3 weeks, he continued following her on alternate days. The pattern was always the same. After her shift, Sarah took leftovers to different families in her neighborhood, rotating based on need. One Friday, however, something different happened. Instead of heading straight home after her deliveries, she entered a pharmacy. Richard waited outside, pretending to check his phone. When Sarah came out, her face wore a look of defeat he'd never seen during her hours working in his home. He followed her back and, positioned strategically near a slightly open window, overheard a conversation that would completely change his perception. "Mom, did you get it?" asked the boy, whom Richard could now clearly see was using crutches. "Only half, son. The lisinopril went up again. We'll have to split the pills until next payday." "But the doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said, Nathan." Sarah's voice wavered slightly. "We'll figure it out. We always do, don't we?" The following Monday, Richard was unusually quiet during breakfast. He watched Sarah discreetly, connecting the dots. That woman who had worked in his home for years without ever asking for a raise or a loan was saving on her own son's medication to help strangers with food that would otherwise be thrown away. "Sarah," he finally called out, "I've noticed there's always a lot of food left over here. What do you do with it?" The housekeeper froze for a moment, her hands tightening slightly around the dish towel. "I store it in containers, just like you asked, Mr. Richard." "Yes, but after that, when the containers pile up in the fridge and no one eats them," Sarah hesitated, weighing her words. "Would you prefer I throw it away?" "I'm asking what you currently do, not what I prefer." A heavy silence settled between them until Sarah took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eyes, something she rarely did. "Some people in my neighborhood are struggling, Mr. Richard. Food that goes to waste here could make a difference. On their tables. If that's a problem, I can stop immediately." The dignity in her voice, without apologies or excessive justifications, left an unexpected impression on Richard. "It's not a problem," he finally replied. "In fact, I think we should separate those leftovers better, so they stay suitable for eating. The surprise in Sarah's eyes was quickly replaced by a slight nod. From that day on, without any explicit mention of the matter, the amount of leftovers in the Anderson household increased considerably. Dinners were planned with generous portions, and Richard began regularly bringing extra groceries he accidentally bought or didn't really like. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. A few weeks later, driven by a curiosity he couldn't even explain to himself, Richard hired a private investigator to learn more about Sarah Miller. The report he received left him stunned. Sarah wasn't just a housekeeper, as he had always assumed. Before working for families, she had been a university professor with a master's degree in American literature. She had abandoned her promising career when her son Nathan, at 5 years old, was diagnosed with a rare degenerative disease that affected his mobility and required ongoing, expensive treatment. The boy's condition had no cure, only treatments to slow its progression and improve his quality of life. With medical costs far exceeding her professor's salary and the need for flexible hours to accompany her son to therapy, Sarah made the choice many mothers would. She gave up her professional dreams for him. The investigator also discovered that, in addition to helping her neighbors with food, Sarah organized a small study group for neighborhood children on Saturdays. There, she taught for free what she had once taught in university classrooms. This revelation deeply unsettled Richard. For years, he had treated Sarah as just another employee, politely, but with the distance his social position demanded. It had never occurred to him to ask about her life, her dreams, her story. Now he realized that the quiet woman who cleaned his home carried a story of sacrifice and resilience that made his own sacrifices to build his empire seem trivial. One evening, Richard decided to visit Sarah's neighborhood again. This time not to follow her, but to see that community with new eyes. He parked his car, a less flashy model he rarely used, and walked down the now familiar streets. That's when he heard shouts coming from the direction of Sarah's apartment. Without thinking, he quickened his pace until he stood before her, door where a neighbor was frantically knocking. "Sarah, he's having another episode." "I already called the taxi, but I don't think it'll arrive in time." Richard saw the door open, and Sarah appeared holding Nathan in her arms. The boy was trembling, his breathing labored. "What happened?" Richard asked, surprising even himself by getting involved. Sarah looked at him fearfully, clearly confused by his presence there. "Mr. Richard, what are you—" "It doesn't matter now. My car is right there. I can take you to the hospital." There was no time for explanations or hesitation. Within minutes, they were in Richard's car, speeding through the city toward the nearest hospital. In the back seat, Sarah cradled her son, murmuring words of comfort as silent tears streamed down her face. At the hospital, the medical team acted quickly, taking Nathan in for treatment. Richard stayed in the waiting room beside Sarah, who seemed to have aged years in just a few hours. "The doctor said we need to increase his medication dose," she finally explained, breaking the awkward silence. "But I can't afford enough. We've been splitting the pills for months." Shame hit Richard like a punch. While he'd been complaining about the rising cost of his imported wine collection, this woman had been literally cutting in half the medicine that kept her son alive. "Sarah, how much is the full treatment?" She shook her head. "That's not why you're here, I imagine." "Actually, why are you here? How did you know where I live?" The direct question caught him off guard. Richard considered lying, making up some excuse about urgent paperwork, but something in this woman's dignity demanded honesty. "I followed you a few weeks ago. I noticed food going missing and thought—" He stopped, realizing how absurd it sounded now. "I thought you were taking things from my house." Instead of the outrage he expected, he saw only exhaustion on her face. "I see. So now what? Are you firing me?" "No, the opposite. I want to help." "I don't need charity, Mr. Richard. I need my job and my paycheck." "It's not charity," he insisted. "It's a correction. How long have you worked for me?" 5 years and 7 months. "And I never asked for a raise or adjustment," she added before he could speak. "Exactly. That's not right. And Nathan's treatment, we've managed. By cutting pills in half. His voice came out harsher than he meant. Before Sarah could reply, the doctor returned with news. Nathan was stable, but would need to stay hospitalized for a few days. And, more importantly, they couldn't continue with the reduced dosage. As the doctor walked away, Richard saw Sarah clutch her worn purse tightly, doing mental math that clearly didn't add up. "I'll pay for the treatment," he said firmly. "No, thank you, but no," she replied immediately. "Why?" "Because I don't want to owe anyone, especially not my boss." The pride in her voice surprised Richard. In his world, favors and debts were common currency, constantly traded and negotiated. Sarah's refusal was something new to him. "Then take it as an advance, or a loan if you prefer." Sarah studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. "Why do you care, Mr. Richard? Honestly, a week ago you barely knew my full name." The question hit him with unexpected force. Why did he care? What were this woman and her son to him beyond employees? "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Maybe because I never really looked at the people around me until now." That night, Richard did something he'd never imagined. He slept in an uncomfortable hospital chair beside his housekeeper, waiting for news about a boy he barely knew. And strangely, he felt more connected to humanity than he had in decades of living in his isolated world of luxury. The next morning, without fanfare, Richard went to the hospital pharmacy and secured a year's worth of medication for Nathan. He didn't tell Sarah right away. When she finally found out days later, there was a tense argument. But faced with her son's health, Sarah accepted the help. Not as charity, she insisted, but as an advance she would repay with extra work. The experience of that night at the hospital sparked something unexpected in Richard. He began observing not just Sarah, but all the employees in his home and company more closely. He started noticing the small daily struggles each one faced. Stories that had always been there, but he'd never bothered to learn. 2 weeks later, Jennifer, Richard's niece and only close relative since his wife's passing, arrived for her monthly visit. At 35, she was an ambitious woman who had never hidden her expectation of inheriting her uncle's fortune. Used to treating him as a future investment, she immediately noticed the change in his behavior. "What's gotten into you, Uncle?" she asked during dinner, watching how differently he interacted with the staff. "You seem distracted. And why are you asking about the Gardner's family?" "I'm just getting to know the people who've worked for me for years," Richard replied. "I found out his granddaughter is the first in their family to go to college." Jennifer rolled her eyes. "Please don't tell me you're having one of those life purpose moments rich people get when they turn 60. We've seen this movie before." Richard smiled faintly, ignoring his niece's sarcasm. That same night, while Jennifer worked on her laptop in the living room, he passed through the kitchen and found Sarah organizing the dinner leftovers. "There's a lot of chicken left today," he remarked casually, "and that broccoli rice Christina wouldn't even try." Sarah nodded, now comfortable with their unspoken agreement. "It'll feed about 3 families, Mr. Richard." "Including Mrs. Jenkins?" he asked, surprising her by mentioning a name he'd never shared with her before. Sarah stared at him, finally understanding. "You followed me more than once." It wasn't a question, but Richard nodded anyway. "I wanted to understand at first out of suspicion, then curiosity, I guess. And now, why do you still care what I do with your leftovers?" The question hung between them, loaded with meanings. Richard was still learning to decipher. "Because I never cared about what happened to the things I discarded," he finally answered. "Not the food, not the people." The moment of vulnerability was interrupted by Jennifer, who unexpectedly walked into the kitchen. "Uncle, I need your signature for—" She stopped, eyeing the scene warily. "Am I interrupting something?" "No, nothing important," Richard replied quickly, noticing how Sarah immediately lowered her gaze and assumed the submissive posture expected of her. "What do you need?" As he followed his niece to the office, Richard couldn't help but notice the calculating look she gave Sarah. Something told him Jennifer had picked up on the shift in his dynamic with the housekeeper, and it bothered her deeply. In the days that followed, Richard surprised everyone by announcing he was taking a vacation, something he hadn't done in over a decade. Even more surprising, he wouldn't be traveling abroad as usual, but would stay in Los Angeles. "I want to get to know the city I've lived in for 50 years, he explained to a skeptical Jennifer. What he didn't say was that he planned to visit Sarah's neighborhood again, this time not as a furtive observer, but as someone willing to truly understand that reality. On a Friday evening, dressed in simple clothes he rarely wore, he drove his least conspicuous car to the community. He parked near the central square and walked slowly, observing the life pulsing around him. Children playing soccer on a makeshift field, elderly folks chatting on worn-out benches, small shops still open at that hour. That's when he spotted Sarah stepping out of a small community center, accompanied by about 10 children of different ages. Each carried a book, and they all seemed excited about something she had said. Among them was Nathan, visibly better than the last time he'd seen him, using crutches to move but with a smile that lit up his face. Richard kept his distance, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but he could hear when one of the boys asked, "Miss Sarah, can we continue the Toni Morrison story next week?" "Of course, Kevin, and don't forget to think about those questions we discussed about the Ernest Hemingway book." Miss Sarah. The title sounded so natural, so fitting for her. Far more than maid or employee. Here among those children, she was who she was always meant to be, an educator, a mentor. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, back to the story. Without realizing it, Richard had gotten too close, and when Nathan turned, he recognized him immediately. "Mom, look, it's the man who took us to the hospital." Sarah turned in surprise, her face a mix of confusion and embarrassment at seeing her boss standing there, in the middle of her neighborhood, watching her. "Mr. Richard, what are you doing here?" The children stared curiously at the older man, clearly out of place on those streets. "I was just getting to know the neighborhood," he replied, feeling strangely nervous, as if caught doing something wrong. "I didn't know you taught. They're not exactly classes," Sarah explained, gently dismissing the children with a wave. "It's a reading group for the kids in the neighborhood. On Saturdays, we do tutoring." Nathan stepped forward, leaning on his crutches. "Do you want to join? We're studying Ernest Hemingway. He's the greatest American writer." The boy's enthusiasm caught Richard off guard. In his social circle, children were seen but rarely heard, and they certainly didn't discuss classic literature with such passion. "Maybe one day," he replied with a hesitant smile, "if your mother doesn't mind." "You'd be welcome," Sarah said, her tone polite but guarded. "But I imagine you have more important things to do than sit in uncomfortable chairs discussing literature with kids." There was a hint of challenge in her words that didn't go unnoticed. "I'm not so sure I do," Richard answered honestly. "Truthfully, I don't even know what's really important anymore." His response seemed to surprise Sarah, who studied him for a moment before turning to her son. "Nathan, go ahead with Mrs. Wilson. I need to talk to Mr. Richard." When the boy walked away, she faced her boss directly. "What's going on, Mr. Richard? First you follow me, then show up at the hospital, and now you're here in my neighborhood. What do you want from me?" The direct question caught him off guard. What did he want? He wasn't even sure. "I'm trying to understand something, Sarah, about myself, about the life I've built. And I'm part of this journey of self-discovery." There was a slight edge of irony in her voice, but also genuine curiosity. "In a way, you've shown me another world, one that's always been right beside me, but I never really saw." Sarah sighed, softening slightly. "Look, I'm grateful for everything you did for Nathan, truly. The medication made all the difference. But if you're looking for some kind of redemption or charity project, I'd rather not be part of it." "That's not it," Richard protested, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. "I just wanted to learn more about the work you do here, maybe help in some way." She studied him carefully, as if weighing his sincerity. "We're in need of books," she finally said. "We share the few we have, but the children need their own materials to study at home." "Consider it done," Richard replied promptly, grateful for a concrete opportunity to help. "I'll make a book donation next week. I can bring them personally." A small smile appeared on Sarah's face. The children will love that, especially Nathan. He reads everything he can get his hands on. Like his mother, I imagine, the university professor. Sarah seemed momentarily taken aback. How do you know that? Richard hesitated, realizing he'd revealed too much. I looked into your past, hired someone. Instead of the outrage he expected, Sarah simply shook her head with a sad smile. And what did you think of my story? Disappointing. A professor turned housekeeper. Inspiring, he answered sincerely. A mother who sacrificed everything for her son. An intellectual who keeps educating even without recognition or pay. That's remarkable, Sarah. The direct compliment visibly unsettled her, as if she wasn't used to receiving acknowledgement. It's just what any mother would do. No, it's not. Believe me, I know plenty of mothers who would never give up their careers or social status, no matter what happened to their children. The mention of that kind of mother cast a shadow over Sarah's face, and Richard found himself wondering about her family history, about the absence of a father for Nathan. Questions he'd never thought to ask before. I should go, she said finally. Nathan's waiting for dinner. Of course, and about the books. Next Saturday at 10, if you really want to help. As Richard drove back to his mansion in Beverly Hills, he realized how those few miles represented a distance far greater than geography. In less than half an hour, he'd moved between two entirely different worlds that coexisted in the same city, and for the first time, he questioned his place in both. On Monday, Sarah arrived for work as usual, and both acted as if their meeting in the neighborhood had never happened. The only noticeable difference was that Richard now always asked about Nathan during breakfast, showing genuine interest in the boy's well-being. Meanwhile, Jennifer watched this new dynamic with growing concern. One afternoon, as they had coffee on the patio, she addressed it directly. Uncle, is there something going on between you and the housekeeper that I should know about? Richard nearly choked on his coffee. What do you mean? Come on, I'm not blind. The private conversations, your sudden interest in her life, the way you look at her. She's much younger than you, but it wouldn't be the first time a man in your position got involved with an employee. Don't be ridiculous, Jennifer, Richard replied firmly, genuinely offended by the insinuation. My interest in Sarah and her son is purely human. I'm helping with the boy's medical treatment. Jennifer raised her eyebrows. Medical treatment? Since when did you become a philanthropist? It's not philanthropy when you're helping someone who's worked for you for years. Call it what you want, Jennifer shrugged. Just be careful not to be taken advantage of. Sad stories have always been an easy way into a lonely man's wallet. The cruel implication bothered Richard more than he cared to admit, not because he believed it, but because it showed so clearly how Jennifer saw the world, a place where every action had a hidden motive, where genuine kindness was just a front for manipulation. And the worst part was realizing that, until just a few weeks ago, he probably would have thought the same way. The following Saturday, as agreed, Richard drove to the community center carrying 3 boxes of carefully selected books. There were classics of American literature in affordable editions, children's and young adult books, reference works, and even some technical manuals that might interest teenagers. Ignoring his assistant's advice to simply send the books, he insisted on delivering them personally. The small warehouse was full of children sitting in a circle, with Sarah at the center, reading aloud a passage from The Little Prince. When Richard walked in carrying the first box, all heads turned toward him. Nathan was the first to recognize him. "That's my mum's friend," he announced cheerfully, making Sarah blush slightly at the description. "Good morning, everyone," Richard greeted, feeling strangely nervous before this young audience. "I brought some books I thought you might like." The children gathered around curiously as he opened the boxes. Their eyes sparkled at the sight of the new, colorful books, many with illustrations that immediately invited them to read. "Are these all for us?" asked a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7. "Yes, all for you," Richard confirmed, "to read here and take home." The joy that erupted in that room was something Richard would never forget. Children hugging, books like treasures, showing each other their choices, flipping through pages with reverence. To them, those objects that in his home would have merely decorated shelves were portals to infinite worlds. Sarah approached while the children explored the new collection. "This was very generous, Mr. Richard. I didn't expect so many books, and of such good quality. Please, here you can just call me Richard," he requested. "Mr. Richard sounds odd in this setting." She hesitated, decades of social conditioning making even this simple change difficult. "Thank you, Richard." The sound of his name, spoken by her without the usual formality, stirred a strange sense of closeness. Not romantic, as Jennifer had mischievously suggested, but human, as if for the first time they were seeing each other simply as two people, not as employer and employee. "May I stay and watch for a while?" he asked, genuinely interested. "I promise not to interrupt." "Of course," Sarah replied with a small smile, "but I warn you, our chairs aren't as comfortable as the ones in your dining room." "I'll survive," he joked, surprising them both with the lightness of the remark. Richard discreetly took a seat at the back of the room, watching as Sarah resumed the reading session. The transformation in her was remarkable. Here, before these children, there was no trace of the quiet, reserved woman who worked in his home. Her eyes shone. Her voice took on dramatic inflections as she portrayed different characters. Her whole body seemed more alive, more present. After the reading, she led a discussion about the text, asking questions that encouraged critical thinking in those young minds. Even the youngest children participated actively, respecting speaking turns, building on each other's ideas. It was a masterclass in teaching that many university professors would envy. When the session ended, the children began choosing books to take home under Sarah's careful supervision as she recorded each loan in a notebook. Nathan approached Richard, skillfully maneuvering his crutches. "Did you like my mum's lesson?" "Very much," Richard answered honestly. "So your mum is an amazing teacher." "I know," the boy said proudly. "Everyone says she should be teaching at the university, not cleaning houses." The innocent observation hit Richard with force. It was true. That brilliant woman should be in a university classroom, not scrubbing his bathrooms. "Nathan, can I ask you something?" Richard inquired, suddenly curious. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The boy didn't hesitate. "A doctor. I want to find a cure for my illness, so other kids won't have to go through what I do." The determination in the young voice touched Richard deeply. That boy, limited physically and financially, dreamed not just of his own healing, but of leaving a legacy for others. "That's a very noble goal," he remarked, genuinely impressed. "My mom says dreams don't cost anything," Nathan shrugged, "and that some might even come true if we work hard." "Your mother is a wise woman." When the children finally scattered, Sarah found Richard still sitting in the same spot, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she asked, starting to tidy up. "About how your son wants to be a doctor to cure others like him. About how you keep teaching, even when life took your classroom away. About how I never really knew the people who work for me until now." Sarah stopped what she was doing, looking at him curiously. "Why now? Why this sudden interest in the invisible ones?" The question was direct, almost challenging. "Because I'm realizing how much I've missed, how many meaningful human connections I let slip by because I was too busy counting money and accumulating things." He took a deep breath before continuing. "You know, when my wife passed away 8 years ago, something in me died too. My interest in the world, in people, working and hoarding became a way not to think, not to feel." It was the first time he'd mentioned Elizabeth to Sarah, though she probably knew the story. All the longtime employees knew the basics about his wife's death in a car accident. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "That must have been very hard." "It was. It is," Richard admitted. "But what I'm realizing now is that I shut myself off completely, built walls so high around me I didn't even notice who was on the other side anymore." Sarah nodded in understanding. "Grief does that to people. Isolates us, makes us believe we're safer alone." "You seem to understand that well." A sad smile crossed her face. "Let's just say I have some experience with loss and starting over." The cryptic answer piqued Richard's curiosity again about Sarah's personal story, but he respected the unspoken boundary, sensing that this conversation already represented an unprecedented level of intimacy between them. "Can I come back?" "Next week?" he asked, surprising himself with the request. "I'd like to help in some way. Maybe I could read to the younger kids while you work with the older ones." Sarah looked genuinely taken aback by the offer. "Are you sure? Doesn't seem like the kind of activity that would fill a businessman's Saturday." "That's exactly the point," Richard replied honestly. "Maybe it's time I became a different kind of man." The following week, to the astonishment of everyone in his household, Richard announced he'd have a standing commitment on Saturday mornings. He didn't elaborate, just instructed that no business meetings be scheduled during that time. And so, a new ritual began in his life. Every Saturday, promptly at 9:30 a.m., he parked his car near the community center and spent the next 3 hours reading stories to little children, helping teenagers with math problems, a subject he excelled in, or simply organizing the growing collection of books he continued to supply. As the weeks passed, Richard Anderson, now known simply as Mr. Richard or even Uncle Richard by the children, became a natural part of that space. The people in the community, initially wary of the wealthy man who had appeared out of nowhere, gradually began to accept him, especially when they saw how much Nathan adored him. At the mansion, however, things were taking a different turn. Jennifer watched with growing alarm at the changes in her uncle's behavior. His absences on Saturdays, his increasing disinterest in business, the attention he gave to employees and their families, all of it threatened the future she had so carefully planned for herself. One particularly tense afternoon, she confronted him directly in his office. "You're throwing money away, you know that?" she attacked without preamble. "I heard about the donation you made to that community center in South Central. $100,000, Uncle, to buy computers for kids who can barely read." Richard calmly looked up from the papers he was signing. "First, those children can read just fine. Better than many adults I know. Second, it's my money, Jennifer. I make enough in a day to cover that donation 10 times over." "It's not just that," she continued, unable to contain her frustration. "It's everything. Your obsession with that woman and her son, these trips to South Central, all this talk about purpose and meaning. Are you having some kind of late midlife crisis?" Richard sighed, realizing for the first time Jennifer's real concern. It wasn't exactly for his well-being, but for what his changes meant for her. "Jennifer, sit down," he said firmly. When she reluctantly obeyed, he continued, "I've spent most of my life accumulating money and power. I built an empire, as I like to call it. But for what? For whom?" "For yourself." "For your family, for me," she replied as if it were obvious. "And what would you do with all of it if you inherited it tomorrow?" The question caught Jennifer off guard. I'd keep running the business, of course. Expand it. Maybe buy that hotel chain you always wanted." "For what?" he pressed. "To have more? More money, more properties, more power? And then what? When you have all that, what do you really have?" "I don't see where you're going with this. I'm realizing, maybe too late, that I've spent my life accumulating all the wrong things, Jennifer. I have enough money to buy anything, but until a few weeks ago I didn't have anyone I truly cared about besides you. No one who made me wake up in the morning feeling like I could make a difference in their life. And now you do." Her sarcastic tone didn't quite hide her unease. "I'm starting to. Those kids wait for me on Saturdays. Their faces light up when I bring new books. Nathan showed me his latest test results yesterday. Proud because he's responding well to treatment. These are connections, Jennifer. Real, meaningful ones." She shook her head, visibly upset. "Connections you're buying, with your money." "At first, maybe," Richard admitted. "But now it's not my money that makes those kids run to hug me when I arrive. It's not my bank account that makes Nathan want to show me his drawings or tell me about his dreams of becoming a doctor. You're being naive, Uncle. They know exactly who you are and how much you're worth." The harshness of Jennifer's words struck Richard, not because they might be true, but because they revealed so much about her worldview. "Maybe you're right," he finally replied. "Maybe I am being a foolish old man. But you know what? I'd rather be a happy fool than keep being the bitter, lonely man I was for so long." Jennifer stood up, clearly frustrated. "I just hope you don't regret it when you realize you're being used, especially by that maid." When she slammed the door on her way out, Richard remained seated, reflecting on her words. Jennifer's suspicion was natural, considering the world they lived in. But something inside him knew that what he'd experienced these past weeks went beyond manipulation or self-interest. It was something he'd forgotten: shared humanity, genuine connections, purpose beyond accumulation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now continuing. The following Saturday, Richard arrived at the community center earlier than usual, eager to share some news with Sarah. He'd managed to get a doctor friend, a specialist in Nathan's condition, to agree to evaluate him, for free, and include him in an experimental program showing promising results. He found the place still locked, which was unusual. He waited a few minutes before calling Sarah, worried about the delay. When she finally answered, her voice sounded strained and tired. "Richard, I'm sorry I didn't let you know. There won't be class today. Nathan, he had a bad episode last night. We're at the hospital." "Which hospital?" he asked immediately, already heading back to his car. "Cedars Medical Center. But you don't have to come. I'm on my way," he interrupted, hanging up before she could protest. 20 minutes later, Richard walked into the hospital reception, where he was told Nathan was in the pediatric wing. He found Sarah in the hallway near the coffee machine, looking exhausted. "What happened?" he asked as he approached. She looked up, surprised by how quickly he'd arrived. His blood pressure became unstable, and he had some seizures. Her voice wavered slightly. The doctor said it could be a side effect of the new medication or the progression of his condition. They're running tests. "Can I see him?" "He's sedated right now, but you can go in for a moment." In the small hospital room, Nathan looked even smaller and more fragile, hooked up to monitors beeping softly. Richard felt a tightness in his chest, seeing that bright, lively boy, now so still and vulnerable. "He'll be okay," he said with a conviction he didn't fully feel, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You can't know that," she replied without hostility, just stating a fact. "No one can, that's part of his condition. One day he's fine, the next—" She didn't finish, but the fear in her eyes said it all. "Have you eaten anything?" Richard asked, realizing how many hours she'd likely been there. "I'm not hungry." "Even so, you need to eat. I'll get something for both of us." Before she could protest, he left to find the hospital cafeteria. While waiting for the order, he called his doctor friend, explaining the situation and asking if he could take a look at the case, even informally. When he returned with sandwiches and coffee, Sarah was exactly where he'd left her, her eyes fixed on her son. "Thank you," she said softly as he handed her the food. "You didn't have to go to the trouble." "It's no trouble," he replied, simply. "I'm here because I want to be." They ate in silence, sharing that moment of worry and waiting. It was Sarah who eventually broke the quiet. "Why are you doing all this, Richard?" "Honestly." The question, asked so directly, demanded an equally honest answer. "At first I think it was curiosity, then guilt," he admitted. "But now, I think it's because you two reminded me what it means to be human, to care about something beyond profits and balance sheets." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. "Do you know what Nathan told me last week? That when he grows up, he wants to be like you." "Like me?" Richard couldn't hide his surprise. "Yes, not for money or power, but because, according to him, Uncle Richard helps people and makes them smile." As she smiled faintly. "He's a good judge of character, you know. Always has been." Those simple words touched Richard more deeply than any praise he'd received in his long career. The idea that this extraordinary boy saw him as a positive role model, not for his wealth but for his character, was both honorable and daunting. "I'm not who he thinks I am," he confessed. "I've spent most of my life being exactly the kind of man who doesn't deserve admiration." "Maybe. But people change, Richard. Some for worse, others for better. What matters isn't who you were, but who you're choosing to be now." The wisdom in her words surprised him, though it shouldn't have. After all, this woman had been a university professor, had faced adversities. That would test anyone's character. Just then, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a message from his doctor friend, Dr. Thompson, saying he'd arrive in half an hour to see Nathan. "I hope you don't mind," he said hesitantly, "but I asked a doctor friend to take a look at Nathan. He specializes in childhood degenerative diseases." Sarah seemed momentarily torn between gratitude and discomfort. "Richard, I don't want you spending more money on us. You've already done so much." "It's not about money," he gently interrupted. "Robert has been my friend for decades. He came as a personal favor. I just want to make sure Nathan has the best possible chances." When Dr. Thompson arrived, he brought a renewed energy to the hospital room. After carefully examining Nathan and reviewing his tests, he sat down with Sarah and Richard to discuss his findings. "His condition is challenging, no doubt," the doctor explained, "but there are some experimental treatments showing promising results. One is being conducted at the National Neurology Institute where I work." "Experimental treatments are expensive," Sarah remarked, concern clear in her voice. "Usually, yes," the doctor agreed. "But this one is funded by a research foundation. Selected patients don't pay for treatment." Sarah's eyes lit up with cautious hope. "And Nathan could be selected?" Dr. Thompson exchanged a quick glance with Richard before answering. "I believe so. His case fits the criteria we're studying. We'd need to run some additional tests, but I see good potential here." What the doctor didn't mention, and Richard knew, was that a significant portion of the research funding came from a recent anonymous donation, his own. When Dr. Thompson left, promising to send all the necessary paperwork to enroll Nathan in the program, Sarah seemed transformed. The hope of a treatment that could truly help her son, not just manage symptoms, was something she hadn't dared to nurture for years. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, looking at Richard with tearful eyes. "You don't have to," he replied simply. "Seeing Nathan get better will be thanks enough." In the weeks that followed, as Nathan began the experimental treatment, the relationship between Richard and Sarah evolved into something neither could have anticipated: a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared concern for the boy's well-being. At work, however, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, insisting she didn't want special treatment or for other employees to sense any favoritism. Richard respected her stance, though he found it increasingly hard to keep the formal distance of employer and employee after they'd shared such meaningful moments. Jennifer, however, watched everything with growing suspicion. The transformation of Uncle Richard, from a ruthless businessman focused solely on profits, to a man concerned with social issues and personally involved in his employees' lives, posed a direct threat to her future plans. One Sunday, as they lunched together as usual, she delivered what she considered her best argument. "Uncle, I've been talking to Dr. Harrison," she mentioned casually, referring to the family's personal physician of decades. "About what?" "About you. He's worried about these sudden changes in your behavior. He said that at your age, drastic personality shifts can be symptomatic." Richard set down his fork, staring at his niece with a mix of surprise and irritation. "Symptomatic of what, exactly?" "Well, he mentioned that cognitive degenerative processes often start with behavioral changes. Impulsive financial decisions, sudden attachment to strangers, abandoning old habits." "Let me get this straight," Richard interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "Are you implying I have dementia because I decided to be a better person?" Jennifer had the decency to look momentarily embarrassed but pressed on. "I'm not implying anything, Uncle. I'm just concerned about you. Dr. Harrison suggested some tests, just to rule out any issues." "I'm sure he did," Richard replied, sarcastically. "And I suppose he also mentioned a preemptive legal guardianship in case the symptoms worsen." The faint flush on Jennifer's cheeks confirmed his suspicion. His niece was effectively laying the groundwork to question his mental competence and potentially take control of his assets if his new life choices threatened her inheritance. "Jennifer, I'll say this once," Richard spoke, reining in his anger. "I've never been more clear-headed in my life. If that bothers you, that's your problem, not mine. And if you try to have me declared incompetent, I'll make sure you don't get a single cent when I die." The threat was clear, and the silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, he saw real fear in his niece's eyes, not for his well-being, but at the possibility of losing the fortune she considered practically hers. That night, alone in his office, Richard reflected on how his relationship with Jennifer had come to this. He'd raised her almost like a daughter after his sister's early death, invested in her education, opened every door for her success. And yet, when he'd finally found something that gave his life meaning beyond business, she saw it only as a threat to her interests. The phone interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah, her voice bright on the other end. "Sorry to call so late, Richard, but I couldn't wait until tomorrow. Dr. Thompson just called with Nathan's latest test results. There's a significant reduction in inflammation. It's the first real improvement we've seen since the diagnosis." The news instantly lifted the weight of his earlier conversation with Jennifer. "That's wonderful, Sarah. We should celebrate. Nathan wants you to come to dinner with us. So tomorrow. I know it's a bold request from your employee, but I'm not your employer outside of work hours," Richard gently interrupted. "I'm your friend, I hope, and I'd be honored to have dinner with you." Sarah's small apartment in the housing complex was impeccably clean and tidy when Richard arrived the next evening. Despite the simplicity of the furniture, there was evident care in every detail. Books neatly arranged on makeshift shelves, plants in colorful pots, framed photographs on the walls. Nathan greeted him eagerly, excited to show how he could now walk using just a cane instead of his usual crutches, a visible sign of the improvement the tests had confirmed. "The doctor said in a few months I might even try walking without anything," exclaimed the boy, his eyes shining with hope. "That's amazing, Nathan," replied Richard, genuinely moved by the progress. The dinner was simple: rice, beans, a small portion of chicken and salad, but prepared with obvious care. For Richard, accustomed to elaborate meals served by a private chef, there was something deeply comforting about that modest table, shared with people who genuinely enjoyed his company. During the meal, Nathan dominated the conversation, eagerly, sharing his renewed dreams of becoming a doctor one day. Sarah watched him with a mix of maternal pride and caution, clearly happy with his improvement, but careful not to fuel unrealistic expectations. "Nathan, it's time to get ready for bed," she said eventually. "School starts early tomorrow." "But Mom, Uncle Richard just got here," protested the boy. "And Uncle Richard would agree that your health and education come first," she replied with gentle firmness. "Your mother is absolutely right," Richard confirmed, smiling at the boy. "Besides, I'll come back another time, I promise." After Nathan said goodnight and went to his room, Sarah offered Richard a cup of coffee on the apartment's small balcony. The evening was pleasant, and from there they could see the distant city lights, a carpet of artificial stars contrasting with the dark sky above. "He's really doing better," Sarah remarked, her face softened by gratitude and relief. "And he owes that to you." "He owes it to science and the doctors," Richard corrected. "I just made the connection." "You did much more than that, and you know it." She hesitated before continuing. "I never thought I'd say this, but your presence in our lives has been a blessing." The admission clearly didn't come easily for a woman as proud and independent as Sarah, making it all the more meaningful. "You've been the blessing in mine," Richard replied sincerely. "Before finding out about you and Nathan, my life was so empty, materially rich but humanly poor." They fell silent for a moment, gazing at the city below. There was a comfortable intimacy between them now, something that transcended the social and economic barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. "Jennifer thinks I'm losing my mind," Richard said suddenly, with a small, ironic smile. "She suggested neurological tests to explain my sudden philanthropy and interest in social causes." Sarah frowned, clearly troubled by the information. "That's serious, Richard. Is she trying to question your mental capacity?" "Apparently. I think my recent life choices threaten her inheritance plans." "That's disturbing." "It's predictable," Richard shrugged. "I raised her to value money above all else. I can't entirely blame her for acting as I taught her. Still, suggesting you're mentally unfit just because you're helping others, it's ironic, isn't it?" Richard smiled humorlessly. "Apparently, in our world, selfishness is a sign of sanity and generosity a sign of mental imbalance." Sarah grew serious, her eyes studying his face. Be careful, Richard. People desperate for money are capable of extreme actions. You sound like you're speaking from experience, he observed, noticing the shadow that crossed her gaze. Sarah hesitated, as if deciding how much of her personal story to share. Finally, she took a deep breath and began. Nathan's father was a man of means, not rich like you, but comfortable, a tenured professor, respected from a traditional family. When I got pregnant, he proposed. Everything seemed perfect. Then came Nathan's diagnosis, still during the pregnancy. She paused, her gaze lost in memories. His family wouldn't accept an imperfect grandson. They offered me money to terminate the pregnancy. When I refused, Daniel had to choose between me and his inheritance. He chose the inheritance. Richard felt a wave of anger toward the man he had never met. How could someone... People make difficult choices every day, Richard, Sarah gently interrupted. Some choose love, others choose security. I don't judge him anymore. But I've learned that when large sums of money are involved, people reveal their true character. The conversation lasted late into the night, with a level of honesty neither of them usually allowed in their relationships. They spoke about loss, abandoned dreams, and fresh starts, about how life rarely follows the paths we plan, but how sometimes it leads us exactly where we need to be. When Richard finally said goodbye, it was past midnight. Driving back to his mansion in Beverly Hills, he realized he had shared more of himself on that little porch than in decades of business, dinners, and high society events. More importantly, for the first time in many years, he felt truly seen, not as the successful businessman, the influential millionaire, or the potential benefactor, but simply as Richard, a flawed man with regrets and a late-blooming desire to make a difference in the world. In the days that followed, Richard found himself increasingly involved in the community projects Sarah coordinated. Beyond the Saturday reading sessions, he began funding the renovation of the small warehouse, purchasing more computers for a basic IT course, and even hiring volunteer tutors for after-school lessons. Jennifer watched from a distance, her resentment growing in proportion to her uncle's involvement with that community. The final straw came when, during a meeting with the family lawyer, she discovered Richard had started the process of creating a foundation that would receive a significant portion of his estate. That same night, Jennifer paid an unexpected visit to her uncle's mansion. She found him in his office reviewing documents related to the new foundation. "You're really going through with this," she stated, more than asked, her voice cold. "You're giving half your fortune to strangers." Richard sighed, tired of this recurring argument. "They're not strangers, Jennifer. They're people who deserve a chance in life. And it's not half my fortune, just 30%. You'll still inherit more money than you could spend in several lifetimes." "It's not about the money," she exclaimed, though they both knew it was exactly about that. "It's about you being manipulated, about that maid who suddenly became the center of your universe." Anger flushed Richard's face. "Watch what you say about Sarah. She's one of the most honorable people I've ever met." "Oh, please," Jennifer laughed bitterly. "She's an opportunist. She saw a lonely old rich man and set up the perfect scheme. The sick son, the struggling community, the literature classes, all calculated to tug at your heartstrings and, more importantly, your wallet." Richard stood up, furious. "Enough! You know nothing about her. Sarah has refused more of my financial help than she's accepted. She's worked honestly for years, raising her son alone. She's educated, intelligent. She could have chosen much easier paths in life. And you need to defend her honor so passionately," Jennifer taunted. "Are you sure you haven't developed deeper feelings for your little maid?" The insinuation was low, typical of someone desperate to provoke a reaction. Richard took a deep breath, refusing to take the bait. "My relationship with Sarah is one of friendship and mutual respect, something that unfortunately seems to be lacking between us lately." Jennifer crossed her arms, defensive. "You've changed, Uncle, and not for the better." "I couldn't disagree more. For the first time in decades, I feel like I'm becoming the person I should have always been." They stared at each other in silence for a moment, the chasm between their worldviews more evident than ever. "This won't stand," Jennifer finally declared, heading for the door. "I'll protect your interests, even if it's from yourself." The veiled threat lingered in the air even after she left. Richard knew his niece wouldn't give up easily. Too much was at stake, not just money, but an entire worldview, a lifestyle she clung to desperately. The next day, when Richard arrived at the company, he was met with curious glances and poorly concealed whispers. His assistant, visibly uncomfortable, finally explained the reason. Rumors about his mental state were circulating among the executives. "Apparently, sir, there are concerns about some recent decisions, investments in social projects with no clear return, substantial donations, your absence from important meetings." Richard shook his head, recognizing Jennifer's hand in those rumors. It was a calculated strategy, first questioning his mental capacity in private, then sowing doubt in the corporate world. If she gained enough support among shareholders and board members, she could indeed initiate removal proceedings. He needed to act quickly before things spiraled out of control. He called an emergency board meeting for the following afternoon, determined to confront the rumors head-on. Meanwhile, Sarah immediately noticed something was wrong when Richard arrived for their weekly dinner at her house that evening. His tense expression and rigid posture betrayed a worry he couldn't hide. "What happened?" she asked directly after Nathan went to bed. Richard hesitated briefly before sharing the situation with her. As he recounted Jennifer's actions and the mood at the company, he watched Sarah's face gradually pale. "This is my fault," she murmured when he finished. "If I hadn't come into your life—" "No," he interrupted firmly. "This has nothing to do with you and everything to do with Jennifer's fear of losing control over my fortune. It's my choices. Can it bother her, not your presence specifically? Still, maybe it's best if we step back for a while. For your own good." "For my own good?" Richard laughed dryly. "Sarah, you and Nathan are among the few genuinely good things in my life right now. I won't give that up because of veiled threats. But your reputation, your business, they're important, yes, but not at any cost. Not at the cost of my integrity or the connections I truly value." Sarah studied him for a long moment, weighing his determination. "So what's your plan?" "Face this head-on. Tomorrow at the board meeting, I'll make my intentions clear for the future of the company and my personal assets. Show them my decisions are the result of careful thought, not impulse or manipulation." "Do you really think they'll believe you?" "Some will, some won't, but the important thing is to document everything. Create an official record that I'm fully aware and capable. And if that's not enough," the genuine concern in her eyes touched Richard, "then I'll fight. I have resources, contacts, lawyers, and more importantly, I have the truth on my side." That night, driving home, Richard reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. Months ago, his biggest concern was closing the next big deal or expanding into another market. Now, he was willing to risk everything: fortune, a reputation, relationships, to defend not just his right to help others, but also the people who had brought new meaning to his existence. The next day, the meeting room at Anderson Enterprises was full. All members of the board were present, many clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Jennifer was seated near the head of the table, her confident posture suggesting she believed she had control. When Richard entered, accompanied not only by his personal lawyer but also by Dr. Robert Thompson and a renowned neurosurgeon, the whispers ceased immediately. It was clear no one had expected such a swift and well-orchestrated countermove. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice as firm and authoritative as ever, "thank you all for attending this emergency meeting. We are here because it has come to my attention that there are doubts about my mental capacity and the impact of that on my recent decisions." The silence in the room was palpable. No one dared to look directly at him or Jennifer. Rather than fueling rumors or allowing speculation, I decided to address the matter head-on. He gestured to the doctors beside him. "Dr. Thompson and Dr. Ferreira have just completed a full neurological evaluation, the results of which are attached to the documents you are now receiving." Assistants distributed folders as Richard continued. "As you can verify, I am in full possession of my mental faculties, with no signs of cognitive impairment or compromised judgment." Dr. Ferreira spoke briefly, confirming the results and explaining the battery of tests conducted, his impeccable reputation lending weight to The conclusions. Jennifer looked visibly uneasy, especially when Richard spoke again. Now, regarding the decisions that seem to have caused concern, yes, I am diversifying investments to include social impact projects. Yes, I have established a foundation that will receive a portion of my personal assets. And yes, I am reassessing my life priorities. He paused, looking directly at each board member. None of this, however, jeopardizes the financial health of this company or demonstrates any loss of business acumen. In fact, I would argue the opposite. Social and environmental sustainability is not only ethically right, but strategically smart in today's economic landscape. In the following minutes, Richard presented objective data showing how companies with strong social commitments often outperformed competitors in the long run, how corporate reputation impacted financial results, and how global investors were increasingly focused on ESG practices. It was an impeccable defense, blending his renewed personal vision with purely business arguments no board member could easily refute. By the time he finished, the mood in the room had completely shifted. What had begun as a veiled challenge to his leadership had turned into tacit endorsement of his new vision for the company. Jennifer was the first to stand when the meeting adjourned. Her tense face and furious expression said it all. The battle was lost, but in her mind, the war had only just begun. Back in his office, Richard received an unexpected message from Sarah. "We need to talk urgently. Something happened." The unusually alarmed tone worried him. He called immediately, but she was evasive on the phone, insisting only that they meet in person, not at her home or his mansion. They agreed on a discreet cafe downtown, a neutral spot where they were unlikely to be recognized. When Richard arrived, Sarah was already waiting, visibly nervous, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "What happened?" he asked as he sat down. Sarah glanced around before speaking, making sure no one could overhear. "Your niece was at my house last night after you left." The information hit Richard like a punch. "Jennifer went to your house? What did she want?" "First, he tried to buy me off," Sarah replied, her voice quiet but firm. "He offered a significant amount for me to walk away from you. When I refused, he moved on to threats." "What kind of threats?" "He said he could make sure I lost my job, not just at your house, but anywhere decent in Los Angeles. That he could guarantee Nathan would be removed from the experimental program." Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "And he mentioned that accidents happen in dangerous neighborhoods like mine." The anger Richard felt at that moment was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was cold, calculated, focused. "This is unacceptable," he said finally, his voice controlled despite the fury inside. "I'll handle this immediately." "Richard, I'm scared," Sarah admitted, a rare admission for such a strong woman. "Not for myself, but for Nathan. He's finally getting better, finding hope again. I can't risk that." "What are you suggesting?" "Maybe Jennifer was right about one thing. Maybe we should step back for a while, at least until this situation settles." Richard shook his head firmly. "No, that would be giving her exactly what she wants. Besides, it wouldn't solve the real problem. Jennifer won't stop until she has guarantees about my fortune, with or without you in the picture." "Then what do we do?" The question, asked so naturally, "we, not you," touched Richard deeply. Even in the face of threats, Sarah wasn't abandoning him, wasn't retreating just to protect herself. "First, you and Nathan will move, temporarily. I have an apartment in Brentwood that I rarely use. It's secure, has 24-hour security, and isn't under my personal name but one of the company's. Jennifer won't know where to look." Sarah hesitated. "I don't know, Richard. It feels so extreme." "It's a precaution," he insisted. "Meanwhile, I'll confront Jennifer directly. What she did crossed every acceptable line. I'm afraid it'll only make her angrier. Maybe. But it'll also make it clear I'm willing to protect the people I care about, no matter the cost." There was a determination in his eyes Sarah had never seen before. Not the cold ambition of a businessman, but the unshakable resolve of someone who'd finally found something worth fighting for beyond money and power. "I trust you," she said finally. "But please be careful. Jennifer has a lot to lose." So do I, Richard replied simply. For the first time, I have something in my life that money can't buy. And I won't give that up without a fight. That same afternoon, Richard confronted Jennifer in her luxury apartment. Without preamble, he laid out what he knew about her visit to Sarah and the threats she'd made. "How dare you?" His voice was controlled but thick with disappointment and anger. "Threatening a hard-working woman and a sick child? Is this what you've become, Jennifer?" His niece didn't deny the accusations, standing her ground defensively. "I'm protecting our family, our legacy, everything we've built." "No, you're protecting your greed," Richard corrected. "You never cared about the company beyond what it could give you financially." "And you do?" she shot back bitterly. "The great Richard Anderson, who spent decades building an empire without caring about anything but profits, now wants to play philanthropist? Because of a housekeeper and her sick son?" "Yes," he answered simply. "Because I finally understand that all the money I've piled up means nothing if it can't make a difference in someone's life." Jennifer laughed humorlessly. How convenient that this epiphany came with a pretty young woman in a vulnerable position. "Don't diminish what Sarah means by reducing her to a stereotype," Richard said, his voice hard. "She reminded me what it's like to have purpose, to genuinely care about other human beings, something you apparently never learned despite all the privileges you've had." The harsh truth of the words visibly struck Jennifer. "You chose strangers over your own family," she accused, her voice trembling. "That's unforgivable." "No, Jennifer. I chose to be a better person. And if that means losing your respect, it's a price I'm willing to pay." Before leaving, Richard made his conditions clear. "Stay away from Sarah and Nathan completely. If I hear of any attempt, any action against them, the consequences will be severe. And I'm not just talking financially." In the days that followed, a tense calm settled in. Sarah and Nathan moved temporarily into the apartment Richard had offered, though she insisted on continuing to work normally to avoid raising suspicions. At work, they maintained their usual professional distance, though now with a deeper understanding between them. Jennifer, for her part, became practically invisible. She cancelled the traditional monthly visit to her uncle's house, stopped answering his calls, and according to information that reached Richard, had begun discreetly consulting lawyers, specializing in inheritance law. The crisis seemed momentarily under control, but Richard knew it was only a temporary truce. At some point, they would have to resolve this untenable situation for good. It was during this period of apparent calm that Richard made a decision that would surprise everyone. After weeks of reflection and discussions with his personal lawyer, he crafted a plan that would completely alter the course of his life and, consequently, the lives of everyone around him. The opportunity to reveal this decision came during Nathan's birthday. Despite the tense circumstances, the boy was turning 11 and Sarah had organized a small celebration at the community center, gathering friends from school and the neighborhood. Richard arrived early, helping with the final preparations. There was something different about him that day, a serenity, a certainty he hadn't shown in weeks. When the little party was in full swing, with children playing and adults chatting animatedly, Richard asked for a moment of attention. Everyone turned to him, curious. "First, I want to wish a happy birthday to our dear Nathan," he began, smiling at the boy, who watched him with admiration. "A young man who has taught me more about courage and perseverance than any adult I've ever known." Spontaneous applause followed, making Nathan blush with happiness. "But I also want to take this special occasion to share an important decision I've made recently." He paused, searching for Sarah's gaze in the small crowd. "Over the past few months, thanks to many of you here, I've rediscovered what truly matters in life. Genuine human connections, purpose, the chance to make a positive difference in the world." Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "That's why I've decided it's time for a radical change. I've sold my majority stake in Anderson Enterprises. The transaction was finalized yesterday." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Sarah looked at him in shock, clearly caught off guard by the revelation. "I'll remain as a strategic consultant, but no longer as CEO or controlling shareholder. Instead, I'll dedicate my time and resources to the foundation I recently created, which will focus on education and healthcare in underserved communities. He looked directly at Sarah as he concluded, and if she accepts, I'd like to invite Sarah Miller to be the executive director of this foundation. No one better than an experienced educator with deep knowledge of the real needs of these communities to lead this work. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Sarah seemed completely speechless, her eyes welling up as she processed what she had just heard. It wasn't just a job offer. It was recognition of her professional worth, a chance to return to the academic and educational world she loved so much without having to sacrifice caring for Nathan. When the party ended, and only the closest guests stayed to help clean up, Sarah finally had a chance to speak privately with Richard. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, still processing the magnitude of that decision. "Because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it," he replied with a small smile. "You'd say I'm being impulsive, that I don't need to sell the company to help the community." "And you really don't," she confirmed. "It's such a drastic decision." "Actually, it's the most sensible decision I've ever made." Richard gently took her hands. "Sarah, I spent decades building something that, in the end, didn't bring me real happiness. Over the past few months, I've discovered what truly matters. Why would I keep dividing my time and energy with something that no longer fulfills me?" But Jennifer's reaction, she'll be furious. Actually, she's surprisingly pleased. Richard chuckled. Part of the deal included preferred shares for her, guaranteeing a significant income for the rest of her life. It's not the control she wanted, but it's perpetual financial security. Sarah shook her head, admiring his ability to find pragmatic solutions even for the most complex problems. "And what about the offer to lead the foundation?" She hesitated. "Richard, I don't have administrative experience at that level." "You have all the experience that matters," he insisted. "Academic knowledge, community involvement, personal integrity. The rest you'll learn along the way, with the team we'll assemble. Unless you don't want to." "That's not it," Sarah replied quickly. "It's an incredible opportunity, a dream I never dared to have. But I don't want it to seem like you're accepting out of self-interest," Richard finished, well aware of her fears. "Sarah, anyone who knows your story, your integrity, would never think that. Besides, the decision will be made by an independent board, not just me." She thought for a moment, finally allowing herself to envision that possibility. "I think I'd love to accept. It would be a chance to make a difference on a much larger scale than I ever imagined." The smile that lit up Richard's face conveyed more than satisfaction. It was relief, genuine joy at seeing someone so deserving, finally getting the opportunity she should have always had. Then it's settled. The New Paths Foundation will have the best possible director. Nathan approached just then, his eyes shining with the excitement of the day. "Mom, what was Uncle Richard saying about you running something?" Sarah glanced at Richard before answering her son. "It looks like I'll have a new job, sweetheart. One where I can use everything I learned in college to help others." "Like being a teacher again?" the boy asked, who had always known about his mother's former career. "Something like that, but bigger," she explained. "I'll help create programs for many schools and communities." The boy's eyes widened in awe. "Wow, does that mean you won't have to clean houses anymore?" The innocent question touched both Sarah and Richard deeply. She knelt to meet her son's eye level. "Exactly. But you know what? I was never ashamed of cleaning houses to take care of you. I'd do it all again if I had to." "I know, Mom," Nathan replied with wisdom beyond his years. "But now you'll get to do what you really love, right?" "Yes, sweetheart. And that's a blessing not everyone gets in life." The look Sarah and Richard exchanged in that moment carried deep understanding. Both had experienced opposite extremes of life. He, the suffocating weight of purposeless wealth. She, the burden of poverty with dignity. And somehow fate had brought them together so they could teach each other essential lessons about what truly makes a fulfilling life. In the weeks that followed, the transformation in both their lives was remarkable. Richard moved into a comfortable but much smaller apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, a far cry from his former mansion. Not out of financial need. He was still a wealthy man, but because he had finally realized that excessive luxury didn't bring true happiness. His new home was, not coincidentally, much closer to the community center and the apartment where Sarah and Nathan returned after the crisis with Jennifer had settled. Adjusting to this new life wasn't always easy. Richard, accustomed to decades of privilege, sometimes found himself surprised by small, everyday challenges he had never faced before. Cooking for himself, occasionally using public transportation, waiting in lines, ordinary experiences for most people, but entirely new for someone who had always had staff attending to his every need. Sarah, on the other hand, faced different challenges in her new role. Being the director of a foundation with $1 million budget required administrative skills she was quickly developing. There were pressures, expectations, meetings with officials and potential partners. Her intelligence and dedication helped her overcome these difficulties, though not without moments of doubt. One particularly challenging afternoon, after a tense meeting with representatives from the city's education department, Sarah called Richard. "I think I made a mistake," she said without preamble. "I'm not cut out for this job. Those men looked at me like I was an intruder, someone who didn't belong in that world. And those looks are exactly why you are the right person for the job," Richard replied with conviction. "The system needs people like you, Sarah. People who know the reality, not just the statistics. But they have years of administrative experience, master's degrees, PhDs. And you have something far more valuable: authenticity. You know the real needs because you've lived them. That's not something you learn in grad school. That conversation would repeat itself with variations over the first few months. Every institutional obstacle, every difficult meeting, every dismissive glance from bureaucrats made Sarah question her ability. And each time, Richard was there to remind her of her unique worth, her strength, her purpose. Meanwhile, the foundation was beginning to show concrete results. The first major project, a partnership with universities to offer college prep courses in underserved communities, was already benefiting hundreds of young people. The second, a specialized medical treatment program for children with rare diseases, directly inspired by Nathan's experience, was starting to gain national recognition. Nathan, in fact, had become something of the foundation's unofficial mascot. His recovery continued steadily, surprising even the most experienced doctors. Now using only a cane for longer walks, he actively participated in community activities, often accompanying his mother on official visits, where his inspiring story opened doors and hearts. During one such visit to a rural community in Oregon, where the foundation was considering setting up a medical center, something unexpected happened. A middle-aged man hesitantly approached Sarah as she spoke with local leaders. Nathan, standing nearby, was the first to notice his hesitation. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely. The man, visibly nervous, glanced from the boy to Sarah. "Are you Sarah Miller? Teacher Sarah Miller?" Sarah turned, intrigued. She didn't recognize the man. "Yes, it's me. Do we know each other?" "Not directly," he replied, timidly extending his hand. "My name is Michael Roberts. I was a student of your sister, Rachel Miller, at UCLA." The mention of her sister made Sarah visibly pale. Rachel, 3 years younger than her, had completely distanced herself when Sarah decided to keep Nathan, despite the father's abandonment and against the wishes of their traditional family. The rejection from her sister, who had always been her closest friend, had perhaps been the most painful wound of all. "Rachel, how is she?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying her restrained emotion. "Well, as far as I know, she still teaches at the university," Michael replied. "But that's not why. I came to see you. Rachel doesn't know I'm here." Sarah frowned, confused. "I don't understand." "I'm here because I saw a report about the New Paths Foundation and recognized you. Rachel keeps your photo on her desk, you know? An old one from when you were young. Even after all these years, she still talks about you." A wave of emotion washed over Sarah. After more than a decade without contact, knowing her sister still kept her photo, still spoke of her, it was something she hadn't expected. "She talks about me?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. With longing, Michael confirmed. On the rare occasions she mentions you, she always says losing you was the greatest regret of her life. But pride and family pressures, you know how it is. Nathan, watching the conversation intently, moved closer to his mother. Mom, who's Rachel? The innocent question pierced Sarah like an arrow. Her son had never met his aunt or any other member of her family. He had grown up with no roots beyond her. She's my sister, sweetheart. Your aunt? The boy's eyes widened. I have an aunt. Why have I never met her? The direct question, so typical of children, left Sarah momentarily speechless. How could she explain years of family rejection, painful choices, and burned bridges? It's complicated, Nathan. Sometimes adults make mistakes. Let pride speak louder than love. Michael, sensing the delicate moment, gently interjected, I'm sure Rachel would love to meet you, young man. She talks about it sometimes, how she'd love to know her nephew. Nathan's face lit up. Can we visit her, Mom, please? The sincere request touched Sarah deeply. Her son, who had faced so many challenges in life, still had room in his heart for new bonds, a willingness to forgive that she herself had lost over years of solitary struggle. I don't know, sweetheart. It's been so long. Things got difficult between us. If I may, Sarah, Michael said softly, I think Rachel would give anything for a second chance. Her regret is genuine. That unexpected conversation planted a seed that would grow in the days to come. Back in Los Angeles, Sarah wrestled with whether she should reach out after so many years. She shared her doubts with Richard during dinner, at her new apartment while Nathan watched TV in the living room. It's normal to be afraid, Richard reflected after hearing the whole story. Opening yourself up to someone who hurt you means making yourself vulnerable again. It's not just that, Sarah admitted. I built my life without them. I learned to be strong on my own, to not need the family that rejected me. Reaching out now when I'm finally doing well, it almost feels like validating what they did. I understand that feeling, Richard nodded. But maybe the question isn't whether they deserve a second chance. Maybe it's about what this connection could mean for Nathan and for you too. How so? Think about Nathan. He grew up without knowing his extended family. No cousins, uncles, grandparents. That leaves a void, believe me. Richard paused, his gaze distant. And as for you, forgiveness isn't always for the other person, Sarah. Sometimes it's a gift we give ourselves. Richard's words echoed within her. It was true that despite all her outward strength, she still carried the weight of that family rift. She still occasionally dreamed of her sister, still felt a tightness in her chest on holidays when families usually gathered. What if they reject me again? She voiced her greatest fear. Or worse, what if they accept me but don't understand Nathan, his condition? Then you'll have your answer, Richard replied simply, and you'll move forward, knowing you tried. Either way, you and Nathan aren't alone anymore. That last sentence, spoken so naturally, moved Sarah deeply. It was true, they weren't alone anymore. They had a community around them, friends, support. A system they had built, brick by brick, over the years. It took another week before Sarah finally mustered the courage to take the next step. With her heart pounding, she typed a simple email to Rachel's university address, which Michael had given her. Rachel, I hope you're doing well. After all these years, the last thing you might expect is to hear from me. But recently I met one of your students, Michael Roberts, who told me things that made me reflect. Nathan, your nephew, is 11 now. He'd really like to meet his aunt. If you're interested in seeing us, my number is still the same. Sarah. She sent the email on a Tuesday night and spent the following days obsessively checking her inbox. Meanwhile, life went on. Meetings at the foundation, Nathan's medical checkups, her regular visits with Richard, which had become a comforting constant in her routine. It was on Friday evening, as she was preparing dinner, that her phone rang. An unknown number. When she answered, the initial silence followed by a hesitant breath told her everything she needed to know. Rachel, she ventured, her heart racing. Sarah, the familiar voice, now more mature, replied on the other end. I got your email. It took me a while to work up the courage to call. I understand, Sarah replied, surprised by her own calmness. Thank you for calling. Another moment of silence, heavy with a decade of absence. What's he like? Rachel finally asked. Nathan. That simple question opened the floodgates. Sarah began talking about her son, his intelligence, his bravery in facing his illness, his dreams of becoming a doctor, his little quirks and big talents. She spoke non-stop for minutes, the words pouring out like a dam finally breaking after years of pressure. On the other end of the line, she could hear small sobs Rachel was trying to stifle. He sounds amazing, Sarah, she said at last. Just like you. You were always the strong one, the determined one. I was a coward. I chose to please our parents instead of standing by my own sister when you needed me most. Those were difficult times, Rachel, Sarah replied, surprised by her own willingness to understand. We all make mistakes. Some mistakes cost more than others. I lost years with you with my nephew. When they hung up, after more than an hour of talking, they had arranged to meet the following Sunday. Lunch at Sarah's apartment, just the sisters and Nathan. A modest start to what they both hoped would be a gradual reconnection. Sarah was as nervous as a teenager that Sunday morning. She changed outfits 3 times, rearranged the living room repeatedly, and reviewed the menu endlessly. Nathan, sensing her agitation, approached with his particular wisdom. Mom, relax, it's just your sister, not the Queen of England. Sarah laughed, grateful for the lightness her son always brought. You're right, I'm being silly. It's not silly to want everything to be perfect, he observed. But remember what you always tell me. What matters isn't perfection, it's the intention. Sarah hugged her son, amazed at his insight. Indeed, she had instilled that value in him over the years without realizing how deeply he had absorbed it. The sound of the doorbell at exactly 12:30 made Sarah's heart leap. Rachel had always been punctual, another trait that hadn't changed. When she opened the door, the shock of seeing her sister after so many years nearly knocked her over. Rachel looked older, naturally, with premature grey strands at her temples and lines that hadn't been there before. But she was undeniably her little sister, with the same expressive brown eyes and the same hesitant smile from childhood. Hi, Rachel said simply, her eyes already glistening. Hi, Sarah replied, equally emotional. No further words were needed. The sisters fell into each other's arms, tears flowing freely as years of longing and hurt dissolved in that embrace. Nathan watched from the bedroom door, silently moved as he witnessed what he knew was a historic moment for his mother. When they finally pulled apart, Rachel looked past Sarah and saw her nephew for the first time. Nathan, she whispered, her face lighting up with a mix of joy and sorrow for lost time. Aunt Rachel, he answered, carefully stepping forward with his cane. Finally, we meet. The lunch that followed was an emotional roller coaster for everyone. Stories were shared, tears shared, laughter exchanged. Rachel and Nathan connected instantly, bonding over their shared love of literature and science. She, a university biochemistry professor, was amazed by her nephew's knowledge of genetic diseases. A natural interest, given his own condition. In a private moment, while Nathan showed his aunt his book collection in his room, Rachel took the chance to ask her sister about her life now. I've seen some articles about you and the foundation, she remarked. What you're doing is incredible, Sarah. I always knew you'd be extraordinary. Sarah smiled, grateful for the acknowledgement. It was an unexpected path, but a meaningful one. And this Richard Anderson, the articles mention you worked together. Was he really your boss? The direct question made Sarah blush slightly. He was. The story is complicated. Seems like you're close now, Rachel observed carefully. More than co-workers? We're friends, Sarah answered, aware of how insufficient that definition was. He changed a lot. Both of us did, really. Rachel studied her sister for a moment. You know what Mom would say if she were alive to see you running $1 million foundation? She'd probably wonder why I didn't marry the millionaire instead of just working with him, Sarah joked, though with a hint of bitterness. No, Rachel shook her head. She'd say she always knew you'd go far, even if she never admitted it. Dad, too, they were complicated. Too proud to admit they were wrong about you. The revelation surprised Sarah. They talked about me. Always, until the end. Mum kept newspaper clippings whenever you appeared in articles about community projects. She never mentioned them, but she saved everyone. That information struck Sarah deeply. The idea that her parents, despite the estrangement, had secretly followed her journey, perhaps with some hidden pride, was something she had never considered. Why didn't they ever tell me? Why didn't they reach out? Same reason you. Never did, Rachel replied gently. Pride, fear of rejection, the belief that it was too late. The conversation with Rachel planted new seeds of reflection in Sarah, about family, about forgiveness, about the invisible walls we build around ourselves, often thinking we're protecting ourselves when in truth we're only isolating ourselves. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us tremendously as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. In the days following the reunion with her sister, Sarah felt strangely light, as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally been lifted. The reconciliation, though tentative and fragile, had opened a door she thought was permanently closed. Rachel quickly became a regular presence in their lives. On Sundays, they had lunch together. Occasionally, she took Nathan to scientific events at the university, nurturing his interest in medicine and research. The aunt and nephew developed a special bond, as if trying to make up for lost time. Richard watched this transformation with genuine happiness. During one of their weekly dinners, a tradition they religiously maintained, he remarked on the visible change in Sarah. "You seem more whole, if that makes sense," he observed, as they strolled through Griffith Park after the meal. "Like a missing piece has finally found its place." "That's a good way to put it," Sarah agreed. "I never realized how much my family's absence weighed on me until I rediscovered this connection. It's like breathing deeply after years of only taking shallow breaths." Reconciliation is one of the most powerful experiences we can have, Richard reflected. Few things transform us as much as genuine forgiveness, both given and received. Speaking of reconciliation, Sarah hesitated briefly. How are things with Jennifer? The mention of his niece made Richard sigh heavily. Since the sale of the company and the creation of the foundation, his relationship with Jennifer had become civil, but distant. They communicated mostly through lawyers and met only at unavoidable formal occasions. Stable, let's say. She seems satisfied with the financial arrangement, but there's still a lot of resentment. I doubt we'll ever regain the closeness we once had. "I'm sorry to hear that," Sarah said sincerely. "I know how important she was to you." "She was," Richard agreed, "but I realized what I valued in her was more the idea of family than our actual relationship. I wanted so badly to have someone to call family that I ignored her manipulative nature for years. Still, it's a loss. One of many I've accumulated in life," he shrugged, trying to appear more detached than he felt. "But I've also had recent gains that more than make up for it." The look they exchanged in that moment carried an intimacy they had carefully avoided naming. Their friendship had blossomed into something deeper over the months, but both maintained a respectful distance, aware of the potential complications. For Sarah, there was the fear that any step beyond friendship could be seen through the lens of financial interest, both by outsiders and, in her moments of insecurity, by herself. For Richard, there was the worry of betraying the trust they'd built, of seeming like he expected more in return for his help. So they continued their careful dance, enjoying each other's company, sharing thoughts, dreams, and worries, but always keeping that invisible line they'd silently agreed not to cross. The situation would change unexpectedly on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon during a routine meeting at the foundation. Sarah was presenting the quarterly results to the board when Richard noticed something odd in her behavior. She seemed pale, hesitant, occasionally losing her train of thought, completely unlike her usual articulate and focused self. Midway through the presentation, Sarah suddenly stopped, bracing herself against the table. "I'm sorry, I'm feeling a bit..." She didn't finish the sentence. Her eyes rolled back and she collapsed to the floor before anyone could catch her. Chaos erupted in the room. Someone called an ambulance while Richard rushed to her side, terrified. Sarah was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her pulse racing. At the hospital, agonizing hours passed before a doctor finally came to speak with Richard and Rachel, who waited together in the lobby. Nathan had been taken to a friend's house to spare him the immediate worry. "She's stable now," the doctor informed them, "but we need to run more tests. The fainting was caused by extremely high blood pressure, which is concerning for someone her age with no history of hypertension." "What could have caused it?" Rachel asked, the scientist in her, immediately searching for rational explanations. "Stress is one possibility, of course, but there are other conditions we need to rule out." "Has she mentioned frequent headaches recently?" Richard and Rachel exchanged worried glances. "Yes, she's been complaining about them," Richard confirmed, recalling how Sarah often massaged her temples during long meetings over the past few weeks. "We thought it was just tension from overworking." "That could be," the doctor conceded, "but we need to eliminate other possibilities. She'll stay for observation and further testing." When they were finally allowed to see her, Sarah was awake, looking fragile and confused in the hospital bed. Her first thought was Nathan. "Who's with him? Does he know what happened?" "He's with Brian, his friend from school," Rachel reassured her. "We only told him you needed to come to the hospital for some tests. We didn't want to scare him." "Thank you," Sarah sighed in relief. Richard gently held her hand. "You gave us quite a scare." "Sorry about that," she said with a weak smile. "I don't know what happened. Everything just went dark." "You've been pushing yourself too hard," Rachel remarked with sisterly concern. "You've always been like this, even as a child, never knowing your limits." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, though something in her eyes suggested she suspected it was more than simple exhaustion. The tests continued over the following days. Richard practically moved into the hospital, working remotely from his laptop in Sarah's room or the cafeteria. Rachel divided her time between teaching at the university, caring for Nathan, and visiting her sister. The boy, when he was finally told about his mother's hospitalization, showed surprising maturity, taking on small responsibilities at home to help and promising not to worry too much. It was on the afternoon of the third day that the neurologist asked to speak with Sarah privately. When Richard and Rachel were called back into the room 20 minutes later, they found her pensive but strangely calm. "What happened?" Rachel asked, alarmed by the atmosphere in the room. Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "They found something on the MRI, a brain aneurysm, small but in a delicate spot." The news hit Richard like a physical blow. Rachel, with her scientific background, immediately began asking the doctor technical questions about size, location, treatment options. Richard, however, could only stare at Sarah, absorbing the sudden fragility of the life they had built together. "We'll need to operate," the neurologist explained, a middle-aged man with a kind but straightforward demeanor. "The good news is we caught it before any rupture. The surgery has a high success rate." "And if we don't operate?" Sarah asked. "The aneurysm will likely continue growing. Eventually, the risk of rupture would become significant. In that scenario, the consequences could be severe." The weight of that unspoken word, fatal, hung in the air. "How long do we have to decide?" Richard finally managed to ask. "It's not an immediate emergency, but I wouldn't recommend delaying more than a few weeks. The sooner we intervene, the better the chances." When the doctor left, a heavy silence fell over the room. It was Sarah who finally broke it. "Well, it seems my body chose an inconvenient time to present me with this challenge," she remarked, with forced humor that fooled no one. "Don't talk like that," Rachel gently scolded her. "This is serious, Sarah." "I know," she replied, her facade of strength momentarily crumbling. "Believe me, I know. I'm trying not to panic, thinking about Nathan." The mention of her son shattered the composure she had been struggling to maintain. Tears began silently streaming down her face. "What if something happens to me? He's already lost so much, been through so much hardship. He can't lose his mother too." "Nothing will happen to you," Richard declared with a firmness he didn't truly feel. "We'll find the best specialists, ensure you get the best possible treatment." "Money doesn't solve everything, Richard," Sarah replied without hostility, simply stating a fact. "Some things are beyond even the wealthiest people's control." It was true, and Richard knew that better than anyone. His entire fortune hadn't saved his wife from the accident that took her years ago. It hadn't secured his niece's true love. Some problems simply couldn't be fixed by writing a check, but that didn't mean they were powerless. "You're right," he agreed. "But we still have options, we have resources, and most importantly, you're not alone in this fight." Rachel nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. We're here. All of us. You've built an incredible support network, Sarah. Now it's time to let them take care of you for a while." In the days that followed, a campaign spontaneously mobilized around Sarah. Her colleagues at the foundation rearranged schedules and projects so she could step away without worry. The families from the community center, upon hearing their benefactor was ill, organized an interdenominational prayer chain. Rachel temporarily took custody of Nathan, moving into Sarah's apartment to keep her nephew's routine as normal as possible. And Richard became a constant presence, quiet but unwavering. After consulting multiple specialists, they reached a consensus on the best neurosurgeon for the case, Dr. William Mitchell, a Brazilian who had built an international career and recently returned to the country to lead a center of excellence in neurosurgery. The surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks later, enough time for Sarah to organize her life and prepare herself physically and emotionally. The night before the operation, after a quiet dinner at home with Nathan and Rachel, Sarah asked for a few moments alone with her son. Richard and Rachel discreetly stepped out onto the balcony, giving them privacy. "Son, there are some things I need you to know," Sarah began, holding the boy's hands as they sat together on his bed. "Mom, please don't talk like it's—" Nathan couldn't finish, his voice breaking. "I'm not saying goodbye," she quickly assured him. "I just want to make sure certain things are said. Tomorrow is just surgery, but it made me realize I've put off important conversations out of fear, or thinking there'd always be time later." Nathan nodded, his attentive eyes fixed on his mother. "First, I want you to know you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every hard moment, it was all worth it because it brought me you." "I know, Mom," the boy replied, tears welling up. "Second, you have never ever been a burden. Your condition, the treatments, the struggles, none of that diminished the joy I feel being your mother. If anything, it taught me what true strength is." Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "Third, about your father. I never wanted to talk much about him, and that was unfair to you. Daniel is a complicated man, brilliant like you, passionate about science, but weak in some fundamental ways. His choices were his, not yours. None of what happened was your fault." "Does he know about me?" Nathan asked, a question he'd clearly held onto for a long time. "Yes," Sarah admitted, deciding the time for full honesty had come. "He gets occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. He's never tried direct contact, and I've never pushed for it. Maybe that was a mistake. If you ever want to meet him when you're older, I'll support your decision." The raw honesty of that conversation was new between them. They'd always been close, but Sarah had kept certain doors closed, trying to shield her son from truths she thought were too painful. Now, faced with the uncertainty of tomorrow, she realized hiding those truths had created unnecessary distance. "And fourth," she continued, a small smile softening her expression, "whatever happens tomorrow, you won't be alone. You have your Aunt Rachel now. You have an entire community that adores you. And you have Richard. You and Uncle Richard," Nathan began hesitantly. "We're friends," Sarah finished automatically. "Mom," the boy rolled his eyes with preteen exasperation, "I'm not a kid anymore. I see how you look at each other. It's just like the soap operas you watch, thinking I don't notice." The surprisingly sharp observation made Sarah laugh, momentarily easing the tension. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Only if you make it complicated," Nathan replied, with the straightforward simplicity of youth. "He likes you. You like him. What's the problem?" "There are stories, contexts you don't fully understand." "I understand enough," the boy insisted. "I know he was your boss. I know he's rich, and you were afraid people would think bad things, but does that matter now?" The unexpected wisdom in her son's words struck Sarah deeply. The barriers that had once seemed so important, social differences, concerns about appearances, fear of judgment, now felt trivial in the face of life's fragility. "You're right," she finally admitted. "It doesn't matter. It shouldn't." Matter? On the balcony, unaware of the mother-son conversation, Rachel gazed at the city skyline while Richard stood silently beside her, lost in thought. "Hey, you love her, don't you?" she asked suddenly, without preamble. The direct question caught Richard off guard. "Is it that obvious?" "To anyone with eyes," she smiled gently. "The question is, why haven't you told her?" "It's complicated." "Adults always say that," Rachel chuckled. "But most of the time we're the ones complicating what could be simple." Richard considered her words, recognizing their truth. "I'm afraid she'll think I expect something in return for everything I've done, that she'll feel obligated somehow." "Then you really don't know my sister." Rachel shook her head. "Sarah has never felt obligated to anyone in her life. She's the most stubbornly independent person I've ever met. Even so, there's a historical imbalance. Between us, that's hard to ignore." "There was," Rachel corrected. "You've turned this relationship into something completely different. You're not the millionaire boss anymore, and she's not the employee. You're two people who've gone through transformative journeys together." Richard reflected on that perspective, realizing he'd never truly considered things that way. What if she doesn't feel the same? He voiced his deepest fear. "It could ruin the friendship we have." Rachel sighed in exasperation. "Men," she muttered, rolling her eyes. "You take on multinational corporations, build empires, but tremble at the possibility of rejection. Listen, I can't speak for my sister, but I think you'd be surprised by what she'd say if you were just honest about your feelings." The conversation was interrupted when the balcony door opened and Sarah appeared, her eyes slightly red but with a serene expression. "Nathan finally fell asleep," she informed them. "It was an important talk." "Are you okay?" asked Rachel, noticing the signs of emotion. "Yes, just emotionally drained. We needed to have this conversation a long time ago." Richard watched Sarah closely, impressed by her strength and dignity even in the face of such uncertainty. As always, she thought of others first, making sure Nathan was emotionally prepared, that the Foundation's projects continued uninterrupted, that no one worried too much. "We should all get some rest," Rachel suggested, noticing the exchanged glances between Richard and Sarah. "Richard, are you going home, or—" "I think I'll stay a little longer, if Sarah doesn't mind," he replied, "just to make sure everything's set for tomorrow." "Of course," Rachel nodded, understanding the cue. "I'll take a shower and lie down. The ambulance arrives at 6 a.m., right?" "Right," Sarah confirmed. "I'll be ready." When Rachel left, Sarah and Richard were alone in the small living room. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that only exists between people who've moved beyond the need to fill every moment with words. "Are you scared?" he finally asked, choosing the direct honesty that had always defined their relationship. Sarah considered the question for a moment. "Yes," she admitted at last. "Not about the surgery itself. About the risks, the unknown. About what I could lose." "I understand that feeling," Richard nodded. "Living so long focused only on surviving, on taking care of Nathan, overcoming every obstacle. And now, when things are finally good, when there's so much to live for." "Exactly," she smiled, grateful he understood without needing elaborate explanations. "It's almost ironic. I spent years without being afraid of anything, because I didn't have much to lose beyond the basics. Nathan, our survival. Now I have so much. The Foundation, reconnecting with Rachel, new friends, projects, dreams. And you have me," Richard added softly, his gaze steady on hers. "If that means anything." The simplicity of the statement, so different from the usual caution with which they treated their feelings, surprised Sarah. "It means a lot," she replied with equal honesty, "more than I can properly express." Richard took a deep breath, gathering courage for the words he'd wanted to say for so long. "Sarah, Please," she gently interrupted, placing her fingers over his lips. "Not tonight. Not because I'm about to face surgery." He nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I don't want it to be out of fear or urgency," she continued. "If it's to be said, I want it to be on an ordinary day when the future doesn't." feels so uncertain, when it's just a choice, not a reaction to the possibility of loss. I understand, Richard agreed, admiring once again her integrity, her refusal to accept anything less than what was true and genuine. Then I'll wait. I'll be here when you're ready to hear it. Thank you, she smiled, the tension momentarily easing. For now, could you just stay a little longer? Your presence calms me. In response, he simply extended his arm over the back of the sofa, a silent invitation. Sarah hesitated briefly before accepting, leaning against his chest as if it were the most natural place in the world to be. And perhaps it was. The next morning came too soon. The ambulance, punctual, at 6 a.m., took Sarah to the hospital where the surgery was scheduled. Rachel and Nathan would follow later, for the final hours of preparation. Richard, who had briefly returned home just to change clothes, arrived right after the ambulance. The pre-op procedures seemed endless. Additional blood tests, vital, sign checks, detailed explanations of what would happen, forms to sign. Through it all, Sarah maintained an admirable calm, as if acceptance had replaced fear. When the time finally came to go to the operating room, the staff allowed a few final minutes with the family. Nathan was the first to approach, hugging his mother tightly. Everything will be fine, he declared with childlike conviction. You're strong, stronger than anyone. Thank you, son, Sarah smiled, holding back tears. Take care of Aunt Rachel for me, okay? She'll need someone strong by her side. Rachel was next, embracing her sister with the regained closeness of a lifetime shared. We'll all be here when you wake up, she promised. Don't you dare leave me now that I've finally found you. Last, Richard approached the bed. Words seemed inadequate, so he simply held her hand between his, conveying through touch everything he couldn't say aloud. When he finally spoke, it was just one simple sentence. I'll be waiting, as I promised. Sarah nodded, understanding. All that went unspoken. Then the nurses arrived and she was taken into the surgery that would determine so many futures beyond her own. The hours of waiting were excruciating. Rachel alternated between explaining the technical aspects of the procedure, a natural coping mechanism for her scientific mind, and pacing nervously down the hallway. Nathan, surprisingly, was the calmest of the three, immersed in a neuroscience book Richard had given him weeks earlier, as if understanding the process technically could somehow influence the outcome. Richard remained mostly silent, lost in prayers he hadn't said in decades and silent promises to the universe. Occasionally, he checked updates from the Foundation on his phone, not out of real interest at that moment, but as a necessary distraction to keep from succumbing to anxiety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Mitchell appeared in the waiting room. His face, partially covered by a mask, was hard to read, causing agonizing moments as the three of them stood anxiously for news. The surgery was successfully completed, he announced at last, allowing them all to breathe again. We were able to fully obliterate the aneurysm without significant complications. She's stable and being transferred to recovery. So she'll be okay? Nathan asked, voicing the question everyone was afraid to ask. The signs are very positive, the doctor replied cautiously. The next 24 hours will be crucial for assessing any potential neurological damage, but there are no signs of complications so far. For the first time in days, real hope replaced fear. Rachel hugged Nathan tightly, while Richard gratefully shook the neurosurgeon's hand. When can we see her? He asked. She'll be in the ICU for intensive monitoring over the next 24 hours. You'll each be able to visit briefly, one at a time once she's settled, but don't expect much from this first visit. She'll be sedated and likely won't wake fully until tomorrow. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of brief visits, medical updates, and anxious waiting for signs of improvement. Nathan was eventually convinced to go home with Rachel to rest properly, but Richard refused to leave the hospital, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair in the waiting room and renewing his spot only for the short visits allowed to the ICU. It was during one of these visits, on the afternoon of the following day, that he noticed the first real sign of improvement. Sarah's fingers moved slightly when he held her hand. Her eyes, though still closed, seemed to flutter beneath her eyelids. "Sarah," he called softly, his heart racing with hope. "Can you hear me?" A nurse checking the monitors smiled encouragingly. "The sedation is wearing off as planned. She should start waking up gradually in the next few hours." When she finally opened her eyes hours later, the first person Sarah saw was Richard, asleep uncomfortably in a chair beside her bed. Too weak to speak yet, she simply watched his face, the worry lines even in sleep, the unshaven beard after days without proper care. Summoning all her strength, she managed to lightly squeeze the fingers holding hers. The subtle movement was enough to wake him instantly. "Sarah!" The joy in his voice was palpable. "You're awake, how do you feel?" She tried to answer, but her throat was too dry. Richard quickly offered water with a straw, helping her take small sips. "Tired," she finally managed, her voice hoarse. "But here." That simple word, "here," carried so much meaning. She was present, aware, alive. The emotion on Richard's face said everything his words couldn't express in that moment. The doctors were called immediately and performed a series of basic neurological tests, following a finger with her eyes, squeezing hands, answering simple questions. To everyone's relief, Sarah responded appropriately to all, indicating no obvious brain damage. "We'll need more tests in the coming days, but the initial signs are extremely promising," Dr. Mitchell explained with a genuine smile. "You've been very lucky, Mrs. Miller, and had excellent medical care, if I may add." By the 4th day after surgery, Sarah was moved to a regular room. Her progress was steady. Each day brought more strength, more mental clarity, more determination to fully recover. Nathan visited every afternoon after school, bringing books to read to her or simply telling her about his day. Rachel came in the mornings before her university classes, bringing little treats and updates from home. And Richard was always there, a constant, comforting presence. "You need to sleep in a real bed," Sarah insisted one afternoon, eyeing the dark circles under his eyes. "And take a proper shower. I'm starting to see why the nurses wrinkle their noses when you walk in." The joke, her first since the surgery, filled Richard with joy. The return of her humor signaled recovery not just physically, but emotionally. "I'm perfectly fine," he protested, though his aching body vehemently disagreed. "Besides, I promised I'd be here." "And you've kept that promise admirably." She smiled. "Now promise me you'll go home today, take a long shower, sleep in your own bed and come back tomorrow looking like a civilized human being." He hesitated, reluctant to leave her even for a night. "Rachel will be here," Sarah assured him, "and the nurses know how to reach me. Technically, I even have an emergency button right here," she joked, pointing to the device by the bed. Seeing that she truly seemed better, stronger, Richard finally agreed. "A few hours only, I'll be back before you notice I'm gone." "I doubt that," she laughed softly. "Your scent will probably linger for at least a day after you leave." The light teasing, the ease with which they fell back into their usual pattern of interaction, was deeply comforting. It confirmed what the doctors had said. Sarah was truly recovering, her personality intact, her essence preserved. The following week, to the doctor's astonishment, Sarah was ready to be discharged. Her exceptionally quick recovery was partly attributed to her excellent physical condition before the surgery, and partly to her unwavering determination. "You'll need assistance at home for a few weeks," the doctor explained during the final consultation. "No exertion, driving or work. Absolute recovery is the priority." "We've already arranged everything," Rachel assured. "We'll take turns caring for her, me during the day while Nathan is at school, and then he'll take over when I return to the university." "And I'll fill in any gaps," Richard added, "whenever you need me." The return home was celebrated like a true rebirth. The neighbors decorated the building's entrance with balloons and welcome banners. Colleagues from the foundation sent flowers and heartfelt messages. The lobby was filled with small gifts and cards from children at the community center. "It looks like you've won over an entire city," Richard remarked as he helped her into the apartment, where a small surprise party awaited with her closest friends. "I didn't win them over," Sarah corrected, moved by the outpouring of affection. "I built connections. There's a fundamental difference." The weeks of recovery turned out, surprisingly, to be a time of discovery and growth for Sarah. Used to always being on the move, always caring for others, she was now forced to slow down, to accept help, to simply be instead of constantly doing. Rachel proved to be a thoughtful caregiver, though occasionally overprotective, a trait that sparked light-hearted debates between the sisters. Nathan took on household responsibilities with surprising seriousness for his age, preparing simple snacks and making sure his mother took her medication on time. And Richard found his place in this new family dynamic with surprising ease. He visited daily, usually in the late afternoon, bringing homemade meals he'd learned to prepare, initially terrible, then gradually passable, updates from the foundation without letting Sarah worry too much, and most importantly, his companionship, the most precious thing he could offer. One particular afternoon, about a month after the surgery, Richard arrived not just with the usual dinner, but also a proposal. "Are you well enough for a short walk?" he asked after noticing she seemed especially energetic that day. "The doctor said light exercise would be beneficial now as long as you don't overdo it." "A walk would be wonderful," Sarah agreed eagerly, tired of her forced confinement. "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise," he replied mysteriously, "but I promise it's close and won't be too strenuous." With Rachel's reluctant approval, she was about to leave for the university. Richard and Sarah left the apartment and strolled slowly around the block. The simple pleasure of feeling fresh air, watching ordinary people in their daily routines, was intoxicating for someone who had been confined for so long. To Sarah's surprise, Richard led her to a small park just 2 blocks from the apartment, a place she, too busy with work and responsibilities, had never truly explored despite its proximity. At the center of the park was a small duck pond, benches strategically placed under shady trees, and well-tended flower beds. It was a surprisingly peaceful urban oasis. "How did you find this place?" she asked, as they sat on a bench overlooking the pond, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "During your first weeks of recovery, when we were taking turns caring for you, I used to walk here to stretch my legs between shifts," he explained. "It became my little refuge when worry for you became overwhelming." The simple honesty of his words touched Sarah deeply. "It's beautiful," she remarked, watching how the golden evening light reflected on the water. "Thank you for sharing it with me." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, simply appreciating the beauty of the moment, the peace of the place, and each other's company. "Do you remember our conversation the night before the surgery?" Richard asked finally, his voice gentle. "I remember every word," Sarah confirmed. "You said that if I had something important to say, I should wait for an ordinary day, when it wasn't motivated by fear or urgency," he continued, "when it would just be a choice, not a reaction." Sarah nodded, her heart beating a little faster. "Well, this seems like a perfectly ordinary day to me," Richard smiled, gesturing to the park, the ducks, the sunset. "You're better. There are no looming crises. The future doesn't seem particularly uncertain beyond life's normal uncertainties. So, if you'll allow me..." He took a deep breath, gathering courage for the words he had rehearsed in his mind. "For weeks. Sarah Miller, I love you. Not as a boss, not as a benefactor, not as a friend, though I deeply value our friendship. I love you as a man loves a woman he admires, respects, and wants to share not just moments with, but a life." The simple declaration, free of rhetorical flourishes but full of sincerity, hung between them. Sarah studied him for a long moment, her eyes shining with restrained emotion. "Took you long enough," she finally replied, a smile lighting up her face. "I was starting to think I'd have to take the initiative myself, which would have been highly inappropriate for a woman fresh out of surgery." The unexpected answer made Richard laugh, easing the tension of the moment. "Is that a yes?" "Richard," she finished, holding his hand between hers, "I love you too, probably longer than I'd care to admit, even to myself." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked, genuinely curious. "For the same reasons as you, I imagine. Fear of complicating a valuable friendship, worry about outside judgments, and mostly, doubts about whether a relationship between people from such different worlds was even possible. Do you still worry about that?" About who we were before? Sarah thought for a moment before answering. No, not anymore. What matters is who we are now and who we choose to be from here on out. And if I've learned anything from my recent brush with mortality, it's that life is too short to waste chances at happiness because of what others might think. The wisdom in her words struck Richard deeply. For someone accustomed to living under constant scrutiny, prioritizing appearances and outside expectations, the simplicity of her philosophy was revolutionary. So what do we do now, he asked, suddenly aware that despite all his life experience, he was navigating uncharted waters. Sarah smiled, lacing her fingers through his. Now we head home before Rachel sends out a search party. And tomorrow we start figuring out what it's like to build a life together, one day at a time. There was no cinematic kiss, no grand promises, no elaborate plans in that moment. Just the simple connection of intertwined hands, looks that spoke, more than words, and the shared certainty that whatever lay ahead they would walk it side by side. In the months that followed, Sarah made a full recovery, gradually returning to her responsibilities at the foundation, though with a new perspective on balancing work and personal life. The experience of nearly losing everything had taught her the value of slowing down occasionally, of appreciating small moments, of prioritizing meaningful human connections over professional achievements. Her relationship with Richard blossomed naturally without haste, built on the solid foundation of years of friendship and mutual respect. To their surprise, the community's reaction to their romance was overwhelmingly positive. People who truly knew them understood the authenticity of what they shared. Nathan, in particular, was radiant. The boy's relationship with Richard, already close before, grew even deeper. They shared not only an interest in science and medicine, but also a genuine concern for Sarah's well-being, and a similar view on how to protect her without stifling her independence, a delicate balance they were both constantly learning. Rachel, initially hesitant about the relationship, became a fierce advocate after observing how Richard treated her sister, not as a possession or conquest, but as an equal partner, whose strength and intelligence he deeply admired. Jennifer, surprisingly, offered one of the most unexpected moments of that period. She showed up unannounced at the foundation on an ordinary afternoon, asking to speak with Sarah privately. The meeting between the two women, which Sarah later described as civilly tense, ended with a mutual understanding, if not quite a friendship. Jennifer admitted that her past actions had been driven by fear of losing her financial security, a fear rooted in her own unstable childhood before being taken in by Richard after her mother's death, something Sarah had never known. "He changed because of you," Jennifer acknowledged before leaving. "And as much as I resisted that change, I can't deny that he seems happy. Genuinely happy, maybe for the first time since I've known him." The visit didn't lead to an immediate reconciliation between Jennifer and Richard, but it opened a small door that had been firmly shut for months, a possibility of, perhaps in the future, rebuilding some kind of relationship. On a special afternoon, nearly a year after Sarah's surgery, a quiet ceremony gathered their closest circles in the same small park where they had finally declared their feelings. There, under the shade of leafy trees and by the now familiar lake, Richard and Sarah exchanged simple yet deeply meaningful vows. It wasn't a traditional wedding in many ways. The bride wore a light blue dress instead of white. The groom skipped a tie despite Nathan's good-natured protests. He proudly served as best man. And Rachel, as matron of honor, cried more than all the guests combined. And the cake, instead of an elaborate multi-tiered creation, was a simple lemon pie, Sarah's favorite since childhood. What the ceremony may have lacked in traditional grandeur, it more than made up for in genuine meaning. The guests, an eclectic mix ranging from Rachel's university colleagues to families served by the community center, from executives of Richard's former company to the medical team that had saved Sarah's life, perfectly represented the journey that had brought them there. "This isn't a conventional happy ending, is it?" Sarah remarked, as they danced slowly under the string lights decorating the park trees, the sunset turning the sky into an impressionist painting. "No," Richard agreed, smiling. It's much better than that. It's a happy new beginning. Watching from a distance, Nathan mused thoughtfully to Aunt Rachel. Who would have thought secretly following someone could end up like this? Rachel laughed softly. Life rarely goes the way we plan, Nathan. Sometimes it takes us down strange detours to show us exactly what we need, not what we thought we wanted. The wisdom in those words echoed the extraordinary journey they had traveled, from employer and maid to equal partners, from distrust to deep love, from separate worlds to a shared life. At the center of the makeshift dance floor, Sarah rested, her head on Richard's shoulder, feeling finally at home in a way that transcended physical places. Home was this connection, this mutual understanding, this love built not on fantasy or convenience but on respect, shared growth, and the courage to look beyond appearances to each other's essential truth. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked, noticing her distant gaze. "About paths," she replied softly. "About how the one that seemed hardest, most painful, ended up leading me exactly where I needed to be." "Any regrets? Things you'd change if you could go back?" Sarah considered the question with the sincerity that had always defined their relationship. "Maybe small details. I would have reconciled with Rachel sooner. I would have trusted earlier. I would have been kinder to myself in tough moments." She smiled, watching Nathan chatting animatedly with friends. "But the big choices? No, not a single one." Richard followed her gaze, understanding perfectly the meaning behind those words. The choice to have Nathan against all odds. The choice to persevere when giving up would have been easier. The choice to hold on to her dignity and values even in the toughest times. "You're extraordinary, you know that?" he remarked, admiration clear in his voice. "The strongest woman I've ever met." "No," she gently corrected, "just a woman who did the best she could with the hand she was dealt, like all of us in the end." The music changed, but they kept swaying to the same slow rhythm, reluctant to break the moment. Around them, their once separate worlds now blended seamlessly, a living metaphor for the transformation they'd lived. "Where do we go from here?" Richard asked, referring not just to that night's celebration, but to the future ahead. Sarah smiled, her answer simple yet complete. "Home. Together." And so, under stars beginning to dot the night sky, they kept dancing, no longer a millionaire and his maid, but simply a man and a woman who had found, through unexpected paths, not just each other, but better versions of themselves. End of story. If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more narratives celebrating resilience and revealing how life's most unexpected encounters can transform lives. Share your thoughts in the comments. Does destiny exist, or do we forge our own paths?